So the time has come for the crucial moment. I wet only the lower part of the work, and I try to be careful about the upper boundary where the forest starts. I cover the sheet generously with water using a wide flat brush. I try to distribute it evenly so that there are not puddles on the paper and the water is distributed in an even layer. We need to pay special attention to the edges of the sheet because they'll dry first. We can change the direction and also go in vertical strokes. It helps to make the water layer more even. As soon as I've wetted the paper, I go ahead, take action and mix the main color to cover the blue part of the water area. For this, I've used ultramarine and cerulean. At the same time, I see that the water closer to the horizon line has a more light blue tone, while closer to us, it seems more ultramarine to me. It looks more cerulean in the distance. I'm marking the main wave pattern. Remember the exercises. The most prominent parts of the waves are the ones that reflect the sky. We see more sand bed in the other areas. In the shadow part and halftones, I use this tone of brown. I used ultramarine and orange to mix it. We can also add a little cadmium yellow to it. It will give us a more ochre tone. Remember that the more complex the color, the more possibilities and combinations to mix it. So you can mix your own hues of brown, choose whatever is more comfortable for you. And of course, consider the tone in the reference. It's important that we choose a medium tone now that is used to cover the stones. Not the shadows, neither the light areas, but rather the medium tone. If you squint your eyes a little, you'll see the image more as a whole, and you'll see the medium tone. I continue to make adjustments and use a darker, cooler color with the blue tone that I had mixed using ultramarine, cerulean, and a little Payne's gray. I use it to intensify the shadows. I've shown the prominent part where the sky is reflected a bit brighter, and I used the ochre mix to define the wave movement in the middle distance. I used the finest tip of the brush and tried to make the horizontal strokes to show the ripples on water in the distance. The waves there will be smaller in size as they're affected by the perspective, remember? If something stands out too much, in this case I use a fan brush to try and spread and kind of soften it. I add a little violet to my mix and a little orange to the resultant mix. We can also add a little maroon and I start to add shadows. Possibly you won't have to mix the stones in this complex way. You might have burnt sienna or burnt umber. Well, anyway, you can experiment here. I look at the reference and match it to my pencil drawing and I try to cover the shadow parts of the stones. I've taken a squirrel brush for this. It's a smaller squirrel mix brush. I add more cool tones in the form of ultramarine and Payne's gray. and I intensify the shadows. I continue to intensify and adjust, adding volume to the stones, and I do all this while the wash is moist. It's important that we show this effect in a blurred way. The stones must look soft and be done on wet. Only in this case will we get the impression that the stones are underwater. If we create sharp, clear edges, then this feeling of water volume and the fact that the stones are in a different environment will disappear. So we do this all fast, again, while the wash is still moist. In order to keep it moist, you could wet the paper on both sides and also make sure that the humidity level in the room is as high as possible. With these precautions, your work will be drying much more slowly. In some places, I go around the lit parts of the stones, and so the light comes out. I continue to add adjustments. Pay special attention to this stage as it's very important, I remind you. I feel like adding some blue so that these blue tones of the reflected sky are visible against the ochre tones of the stones and the sand bed. This is one of the most important effects in this work. Try not to darken it too much though. We remember that the sky is reflected in the most prominent part of the waves, so it's light. It shouldn't look like shadow, which is logical, right? I add more violet tone to this mix, and the shadows get this violet purple tone. You may see something of your own in this reference. I'm always all for it. You should express your color preferences in your works. Everyone is used to seeing colors differently. Some people see the shadows under the stones as blue, but due to the fact that the stones are warm in tone, kind of brown or even red in some areas, and this tone can't help but influence the shadows as well, I add a little violet to the blue shadows, and then the shadows look more native, fit better, and match the stones. I add more yellow, and it gives me a more ochre tone. I do all this at the same time. I try not to get carried away by detailing one single area, but look at the work as a whole instead and pay attention to its every part so that it looks more complete. Remember that you can wipe some places. In order to wipe and lighten a part of the work, you need to wash the brush and dab it on a clean tissue, and then apply a stroke in the place where you want to lighten it. This way the brush will absorb some pigment together with water, like a sponge, and this area will become lighter. When drying, the pigment sinks deeper into the paper and some shadows become lighter. So we keep adjusting things until the moment we feel that we have pictured all the stones right. or alternatively until the moment we feel the wash is starting to dry, when the lines stop being blurry and become sharp. And this is the time when we have to stop and maybe do another wash after the work has dried completely. Well, anyway, I see that my wash still allows adjustments, so I keep doing that. I'm moving to the middle distance, and this is where the outlines of the stones become less clear. They refract in the waves, the lines become more horizontal there. However, we can still see the boundaries of the stones. If you feel that some places lack volume or aren't clear in shape, then continue to add shadows and show volume. Here it's important to understand how volume works. As I've already mentioned, it's like this imaginary ball, which is in every object with volume. If lit by the sun, every object has light, mid-tone, core shadow, and if you look carefully, also reflected light. This knowledge is really helpful in painting many things. Make sure you place the reference in a way that you're comfortable switching between it and the work. You can use a white flat brush to blur some boundaries if they come out too sharp. Don't use moist brush though. If it's too wet, it will create blooms. Alternatively, you can use a fan brush. It will also give an interesting foggy effect. So yeah, you can create it using a fan brush too. The stones in this work must be painted soft. In the foreground, we can paint sharper boundaries, so when the paper is almost dry, but the pigment still spreads a little, we can move on to the foreground and make it more detailed. Work on it more extensively. Because we remember the rule that things in the foreground are much sharper, so we can paint them in more detail. And this is how we'll create depth. I really like the way these cool violet shadows look in relation to the contrasting warm tone of the stones. If there are some unclear areas, try to determine what you'll paint there anyway. Maybe small stones or maybe a flat area with sand. Let your imagination work here. Sand beds are diverse, right? I'm now working on an important part in this work. I'm showing these glowing rays along the shape of the stones, and again I'm using the wiping method. Every time I dip my brush in clean water, dab it on a clean tissue, and only after that I wipe the stones. If you feel that the paper has already dried or is drying, you can paint these lines using a moist brush. It shouldn't be dripping with water. If you charge more water into the brush, the water will start to push the pigment away, and these white lines will also appear. What I mean is that these white lines can be done in different ways depending on the wetness level of your paper. If it's moist enough and the wash allows further painting with pigments, in this case you can do the wiping using an almost dry brush. In the case when you feel the wash is starting to dry, you should paint these lines using a brush with more water. Then the water and the line that you paint with it on the stone will start to gradually push the pigment away and make the line brighter. Many artists use this technique. However, make sure that the pigment particles that are being pushed away don't create dark lines around the white areas. So you can dab it with tissue immediately afterwards. But be careful, or you can use a fan brush and spread it a little. Note that I also wipe it with the tissue here. My paper has almost dried, but you can see that the white lines still appear. At some stage, these white lines appear well without tissue. But when the paper is almost dry, it's hard to make do with the tissue. So it's the third stage of making these white lines. That's why it's really important to feel the wetness level of your paper and also the way the pigment behaves. These are the little things that painting with watercolor is based on. And of course, don't get upset if you don't feel it yet, because all this comes with experience. Make sure you try and feel how pigment behaves. Even if something goes wrong, you still learn from it and gain experience. And you won't even notice that you'll take these valuable things into account in your future works. I continue to create these white lines, but I feel that they aren't coming out right anymore. My paper has dried, so it's time to stop.